G'day, mate. 40 here. So I read an extraordinary article in Foreign Policy, which is a center-left magazine, right, predictably liberal. And I was reading an article here by Michael Hirsch, which grabbed my attention because it fits perfectly with something that I constantly reference, that you can't make sense of the world and its actors unless you ask, like, how is what they're doing advancing their own personal interests? So Michael Hirsch writes for Foreign Policy, why are so many observers putting the worst possible face on the conflict between the United States and China? Why are so many experts eager to say that we're in a new Cold War? And he then quotes international relations expert Randall Schweller, said that when he first entered the academic job market in 1993, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, international security IS studies were fizzling fast. Now they're hot again. So promoting the idea of Cold War II promotes the careers of specialists in international relations, right? People who study international security. It's good for them getting jobs. It's good for them getting income. It's good for them getting status and prestige. It's good for them getting on CNN and Fox and ABC and CBS. It's good for them getting money to do research, to travel around the world, to host conferences, to go to conferences. So promoting the idea of Cold War II with China definitely promotes the careers of people in international relations and international security studies. And that's true on the China side as well. So hawks in competing states, China, United States, not to mention Australia and Indonesia and Vietnam and Japan and Korea, right? Hawks in all these competing states benefit from each other in their domestic battles. So like the Soviet Union and the United States hardliners of the Cold War, militarists in China are eagerly promoting the idea that the United States seeks to contain China. So these deepening ideological tensions between the two countries today are more likely a product of this dynamic, meaning experts wanting jobs and status and prestige than any growing threat about China and how it's going to, conquer the world. So you don't hear this anymore. Like when I had a bunch of these disputes in 2018, 2019, there were so many people that would come on the show and come in the chat and talk about how China was poised to take over, that the United States was obviously a sick country, that the United States was falling apart, and China was on the ascent, and the United States was not going to be able to successfully compete with China. The United States was falling apart, and states like China and Russia would just take over America. But you don't hear that anymore. I mean, as each day goes by, you hear about more and more vulnerabilities on the Chinese side, right? Remember that widespread feeling that China was about to dominate the world. That was the hot new take, particularly attractive to pessimists on the dissident right. So people in dissident circles tend to be pessimists because they're outside the mainstream, right? They don't have status, prestige, money. They don't get honored by the powers that be, right? If you're a dissident, you're not being honored by the conventional sources of power, prestige, and money. And so you have to, come up with all these different ways to shore yourself up and to reassure yourself that you're really on the right track. And people inevitably in dissident circles tend to become incredibly pessimistic, including incredibly pessimistic about the United States. Even though the United States is on a trajectory to dominate the next 50 years even more intensely than they dominated the previous 100 years. But people on distant circles, they just love to focus on how, the United States is just falling apart. And they'll say, look at
the effects of climate change
coming home to the Democrats, because Democratic messaging is full of and talk about cost of living.
The Biden campaign is blowing it.
Stop it. Stop it. Your poll numbers are not good and you're old.
The effects of climate change are already upon us in terms of our transportation. Indications that turbulence is up by about 15%.
They're blaming turbulence on global warming.
Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Plus,
who did America fight in the Revolutionary War?
Africa.
Yeah, but you got to ask, what's the incentive for people to answer those questions accurately? All right,
Fox News
they're not
alert,
getting paid
closing
to come
arguments
up with
just wrapping up in President
answer.
Trump's trial. And if you
Okay, we'll keep an eye on the news, see if anything happens. But I mainly want to focus on international relations. And this particular scholar, Randall Schweller, he's quite different from his peers because he's about the only major political scientist, international relations scholar, international security scholar who is out front with his support for Donald Trump. He published in Foreign Affairs, right, a liberal left-wing publication, 3 cheers for Trump's foreign policy. What the establishment misses. All right, this guy is Randall Schweller. Right, Donald Trump's victory in the 2016 presidential election heralded nothing less than certain catastrophe. At least that was, and it remains the firm belief of the blob. All right, that's what Ben Rhodes, former foreign policy advisor in the Obama administration, called those from both parties in the mainstream media and the foreign policy establishment who, driven by habitual ideas and piety and false wisdom, worry about the decline of the U.S. order. So New York Times columnist Paul Krugman forecasts after Trump's victory, we are looking at a global recession with no end in sight. Right, didn't happen. Others prophesied that Trump would resign by the end of his first year. So many people I knew predicted that Trump would be run out of office within a few months of taking power. Tony Schwartz, the co-author of Trump, The Art of the Deal, said that Trump would be holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in 6 months. Right, liberal commentator John Aravosa said the U.S. would be headed down the same path that Germany took from the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich. I remember this one woman who was a big activist for Hillary Clinton. Right, she was a very intelligent woman, high-achieving attorney, and she couldn't leave bed. She couldn't leave her house for about 2 months after Trump's 2016 victory. Right, this idea that we're heading down the path of the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich, right, that came from former U.S. President Barack Obama, right, in December of 2017 at the Economic Club of Chicago, where he invoked the specter of Nazi Germany. We have to tend to this garden of democracy or else everything will fall apart. 60 million people die. You got to pay attention and vote. Well, the world has not come to an end, right? A year into Trump's first term, the Islamic State, right, had been virtually defeated in Syria, eliminated from all its havens in Iraq, thanks to the Trump administration's decision to equip the largely Kurdish militia fighting ISIS in Syria and give U.S. group commanders greater latitude to direct operations. So very different than Barack Obama, drone warrior, who would select individual targets for drone operations, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Democratic president of the United States in the 1960s, who would select individual targets for bombing in North Vietnam, right? Donald Trump turned these choices over to the military. Right? Trump continued the Obama doctrine of avoiding large-scale conventional wars in the Middle East. He was the only president to not start a new war, and he succeeded where his predecessor failed in enforcing a red line against Bashar al-Assad's use of nerve gas in Syria by launching targeted airstrikes in response. North Korea, Trump's strategy of maximum pressure has cut the country's international payments by half, forcing Kim Jong-un to realize that his only choice is to negotiate. Now, on the domestic front, right, unemployment rate fell to 3.8% in May 2018, a level not seen since the heady days of the dot-com boom. Unemployment was at an all-time low among African Americans under Donald Trump. They experienced their first major growth in income under Donald Trump. Under Trump's watch, the stock market, consumer confidence hit all-time highs. Number of mortgage applications for new homes reached a 7-year high back in 2018. Gas prices fell to a 12-year low. Trump pledged to bring an end to the era where our politicians seem more interested in defending the borders of foreign nations than our own. Legal immigration was substantially reduced under Donald Trump. And yet, you can find almost no academics who will speak up for Donald Trump. This is Randall Schweller.
And just when it comes to my mind, wasn't that you?
No.
No.
I agree with Democratic piece. My first articles in World Politics in '92 was almost like a defense of Democratic peace theory, actually. I was saying that democracies don't...
So, yeah, democratic peace theory is the false idea that democracies don't go to war with each other.
Wage preventive wars. It's a good piece, actually. It was something about a preventive war and domestic structure and preventive war, democracies more Pacific. But I'm not a democratic peace theorist at all. I totally agree with Mearsheimer. But no, I would never say it's a Mearsheimer. I disagree with him. What I like about John, and what it sounds like what you're conveying, is his audacity. Like, you know, it's a good thing to, he's from that old group of scholars that I learned from, which I have to say, very, very different bunch. They were if you've ever seen The Paper Chase, they captures from 1971 or whatever. It captures this group of quirky individuals who are not entirely socially with it. But that's what's interesting about them. And they make waves, they make big statements.
Paper Chase is absolutely compelling movie. I had a beloved political science professor who could not watch it because it was just too painful. It just hit too close to home. So The Paper Chase is, I believe, about a law student at Harvard Law School and how he falls in love with the daughter of his most frightening professor.
And they're not boring. They're not slick. They're not corporate. There's nothing corporate about them. And I think today's scholars are much more corporate. And they sound, I guess I'm one of them, you know, all these stories about me. But I was a musician for many years. I still am. I'm a guitar player, first and foremost. And I was in a Grateful Dead band. I was Jerry Garcia for many years in New York and New Jersey. And actually, one of my band members joined the Grateful Dead, Rob Baracco. So, you know, we were very close to that. But I always saw the field as more not that it's entertainment. That's it. But you should be entertaining. And you got to say, John Mearsheimer is not only the hardest working person in IR show business, but he's a showman. And I think there's something to be said. I know for young scholars that the way to put it, the way I like to put it, but you have to understand what I'm saying is you need a good rap, like, you know, rap, like a rappy rap. Like John Mearsheimer has that. Whenever he gets up to give a talk, he has something to say, and he's going to convey what he has to say, and he's going to be very definite about it. He's not wishy-washy. You never miss the point.
Yeah, he's straightforward and clear.
Yeah, and I'm telling you, like Mansur Olson was a master at this. If you ever saw Mansur Olson collective action, he could take his theory on collective action and make it tell you a story about anything. Like, you know, he did state formation, everything. But it wasn't just that he had a great theory that he could use for all kinds of things because it was powerful, which is the idea of theories. They should be powerful, explain a lot with a little. But boy, that guy could give a talk. He was like the Mad Hatter. He was like the Wizard of Oz. He would get up there and have a voice you couldn't forget. And it was like, he was like a magician. And I think there's something to be said for presentation and, you know, argument.
But at the same time, it's much easier to have that approach when you have a parsimonious theory. Where you try to say as much as possible with as little as possible. But
you hit it right on the head.
I mean, then it's quite easy to have that approach. But if you have an eclectic theory, empirically rich,
or complex, you hit the nail on the head. That's the take-home point. Is that people like Mansur Olson and John Mearsheimer like theory to simplify, not complexify. And if you're simplifying reality, you're going to have a nice, neat story. It may not work. You could say it's wrong, but at least you'll remember it. You know, the idea of the bumper sticker. You need some kind of bumper sticker take-home point. And I find that that's what's so sorely missing at conferences. Most talks that I see, they're making life way more complicated than it needs to be, and it certainly doesn't make for an exciting talk.
Waltz also said the same thing, right? He emphasized that the theory is constructing a reality, but it's not.
Right, that's Kenneth Waltz.
Not the reality.
Absolutely.
And that theory should simplify reality, not make it more complex.
I just wrote a chapter for a special issue in security studies on the 100th birthday of Ken Waltz. So it's a tribute issue. We hope will get published as a special issue in security studies on Ken Waltz. And I wrote the conclusion. That's one of the things I'm saying. Explain a lot with a little. His whole point is my theory doesn't explain a lot. It just tells you a few important things. And a few important things, it tells you a lot. There's actually a lot more there. But what if you wanted, you could just talk about it.
All right, this is an interview that took place April 6, 2022, so over 2 years ago.
Very simply. and explain a lot with a little. It's E equals MC squared.
So I often play John Mearsheimer, not just because of his wisdom, but because he is a master showman.
That's the point. Parsimony, power. That's what we want.
Nice. All right, so let's get back to business. But nice little intercession there.
So closing arguments are done, and we still don't know what the crime of the trial of the century is. Even CNN says Bragg fell short.
You think, after listening to all of this, you think they fell short? How?
They fell way short, because let's start with reasonable doubt. There is reasonable doubt all over this case. Where is Keith Schiller? Where is Alan Weisselberg? How did Michael Cohen get away with stealing $30,000? Hold a pity party for him. Made $4 million on this. Thought he'd be chief of staff. He's a fixer. Stormy Daniels. Let's hold a pity party for her. It's everywhere.
Trump legal spokesperson
So,
Alina
if you were to
Habba
choose
joins me
3
now.
core
Alina,
realist
so you were
concepts, which ones would you choose and why?
Yeah, I think the reason I like realism are 3, at least 3. But these are the most important. Most important to me, and it goes with the conversation we just had, is that it's about power and influence. And to me, that's the core of politics. If you're a political scientist,
Right, power, influence is what drives people. Why are so many international relations specialists hyping the new Cold War with China, just like they were hyping civilizational struggle with Islam 20 years ago? Because it's good for their status, for their income, for their standing, for their fame, for their sexual access to beautiful young women.
always remember, you're here to talk about politics. And then what is politics? So I know people have various definitions, but I still go back to Harold Laswell's definitive, to me, definition, which is politics about who gets what, when, where, and with what consequences. It's about power, is about influencing others. It's about getting your way. And to me, realism puts power front and center. And so that's just another way of saying realism puts politics front and center. I can't tell you how many times I've read dissertations or proposals, and I'm like, where's the politics? I mean, it's fine, but where's the politics? And, so realism always remembers what we're doing and understands that the world really is driven so much by power and influence. Second, and these are all related, obviously, I think this one is the one that I wish realists would talk more about. I've been saying this all my career: scarcity and competition over scarce resources. I think realism is a...
Yeah, human relations are infinite, all right? Human desires are infinite. We want and we want and we want, but natural resources are severely limited. Social status, right, is limited. Not everyone can be on top of the social status hierarchy. And so as a result, right, we have this struggle that drives people to ever increase their social status, their standing, their feeling of safety by building up their power. And this is what realism taps into.
About material and social scarcity. And sometimes, and we were talking about Mearsheimer and Waltz, I think sometimes they talk too much about security per se. And I think security is interesting. I mean, it's a very important part of realism, but security to me is not necessarily about positional competition. In other words, I don't think security is always scarce, and I don't think it's something that can't be shared by all. I think we can all be secure at the same time. For example, if we all put big locks on our doors, or if we all had a panic room, well, we could all be secure, right? They say, well, states can't do that.
Okay, so security is the number one thing that we desire. We want to have enough food. We want to have a safe place. But then after that, once we feel secure, then we want to launch into life and to make our mark.
Yeah, they actually can. There are times when security can be shared by all. But material goods are scarce, and social goods are scarce, like social scarcity. And here I mean we can't all be the leader. We can't all have prestige. We can't all be the most intelligent or whatever, that's social scarcity. The reason we go to universities these days, the reason everyone needs a university degree is social scarcity.
And speaking of scarce, I was watching, I think for the first time, I deliberately chose to tune into Destiny's live stream yesterday afternoon on my way back from hiking Runyon Canyon in Hollywood. And I was just blown away by the cognitive firepower, the energy, the drive, the quick wit, the quick reactions. He's just incredibly impressive with the way he operates. He's undoubtedly the most skilled live streamer. And he's absolutely the master at what he does. I started upping my estimate for the average IQ of his audience. If yesterday afternoon's show, something about chilling before I go to Israel, if that was an indication of the average cognitive content of his shows, then I'm thinking that the average IQ of his audience is probably like 105 to 110 instead of 100.
Today, a degree is worth less than it was 100 years ago. And that's because we're all running faster to stay in place. That's positional competition. That's about scarcity. That is material resources. We can't all drive, big tank type cars. We can't all do that. It's good to be number one, because in a world of material and social scarcity, you get everything. It's not fair. That's another thing about realism I like, is that it recognizes the most important thing about life. And I'm saying this as life. The most important thing every student that watches this better figure out now is that life isn't fair.
So this man speaking is an international relations scholar, Randall Schweller. And back in 2018, he published an essay in foreign policy, 3 Cheers for Trump's Foreign Policy. So he notes, as his critics charge, Donald Trump does reject many of the core tenets of the liberal international order, the sprawling and multifaceted system that the United States and its allies built, have supported for 7 decades, questioning the very fabric of international cooperation. He has assaulted the world trading system, reduced funding for the UN, denounced NATO, threatened to end multilateral trade agreements, called for Russia's readmission to the G7, and scoffed at attempts to address global challenges such as climate change. Despite what the crowd of globalists at Davos might say, these policies should be welcomed, not feared. Trump's transactional approach to foreign relations marks a United States less interested in managing its long-term relationships than in making gains on short-term deals. Trump has sent the message that the United States will now look after its own interests, not the interests of the so-called global community, even at the expense of long-standing allies. This worldview is fundamentally realist in nature. On the campaign trail and in office, Donald Trump has argued the United States needs its allies to share responsibility for paying for their own defense. He has called for better trade deals to level a playing field tilted against American businesses and workers. Donald Trump wants to protect domestic manufacturing industries from currency manipulation. He is an economic nationalist at heart. He believes that political factors should determine economic relations, that globalization does not foster harmony among states, that economic interdependence increases national vulnerability. He also argues that the state should intervene when the interests of domestic actors diverge from its own. For example, when he called for a boycott against Apple till the company helped the FBI break into the iPhone of one of the terrorists who carried out the 2015 attack in San Bernardino, California. So this realist worldview is not only legitimate, it also resonates with Americans who rightly recognize that the United States is no longer inhabiting the unipolar world it did since the end of the Cold War. Instead, the U.S. is living in a more multipolar world with greater competition. So we may not be fully in a multipolar world. The United States is still the dominant power. Trump is merely shedding shibboleths, right? False myths, and seeing international politics for what it is and what it has always been, a highly competitive realm populated by self-interested states concerned with their own security and economic welfare. So Trump's America First agenda is radical only in the sense that it seeks to promote the interests of the United States above all. But it's kind of stunning that a politics that seeks to prioritize American interests above all is considered radical. And the higher IQ you are, various studies show, the less likely you are to support Donald Trump. Right? His platform is so simple, America first, that the higher you go up in cognitive ability, the more likely people are to denounce Donald Trump.
I tell you, Jonathan Kershaw told me this one. Jonathan Kershaw told me this, and he was so right. He said, well, I know you've heard it, but you don't really understand it. You're not really, feeling it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, okay, so I thought about life isn't fair. Well, that's realism, really. Life isn't fair. The powerful get more. It's the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. That's life. And so you want to be the most powerful in a world of scarcity.
Yeah, where have you heard that statement? The powerful take what they want and the weak endure what they must. Right? It's one of the foundations of my understanding of reality.
Scarce material and social goods. Okay, so that's the second thing. And the third thing about realism I like is well, if we look at the world today, realism would say globalism, interdependence, it's not a good thing. For realists, states don't want to be interdependent. They want to be self-sufficient. They want to be as autonomous as they can be in a dangerous and uncertain world, in a very competitive self-help world. And I think that's, that's a very important difference between realism and most of the foreign policy establishment.
Yeah, realists are comparatively few among America's foreign policy establishment. They're very much a minority. They're widely despised. It is considered de rigueur. It's considered the done thing that American policies should not favor America. It's absolutely bizarre that the cool thing to do, the accepted thing to do, the conventional thing to do, the elite thing to do, right, the dominant way of thinking about how the United States should operate is that it should not put its own interests first.
Particularly the ones that go to Davos, those types.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so I sponsor a lot of people in 12-step programs, and I mentioned to them this paper by an economist that estimated that the average person is about 95% selfish. And given that addicts are often more selfish than normal, which is why they have so much frustration and isolation in life, I recommend to my sponsees, see if you can go for a life that is 90% selfish instead of 95%. Maybe you'll overcorrect and get to a better ratio. So too with states. All right, states should be at least 95% self-interested.
Globalists, the borderless world types, like like Hillary Clinton in our country. She said once, we're not entering a multipolar world, we're entering a multi-partner world. Mm-hmm. For people like her, for people like Bill Gates, the world is certainly globalization works wonderfully for them. They don't have borders. But for most of us, there's borders. And so this idea is, international politics is too serious a business to be interdependent. We don't want to be interdependent. We want them to be more dependent on us than we are dependent on them. When COVID struck, we saw great examples. We didn't have ventilators or masks. They were made in China. It was like penicillin made in China. It was like, why? Who allowed that to happen?
Yeah. Okay. Power, scarcity, and autonomy.
Yeah.
I think the part about scarce resources and scarcity, I mean, you outlined that really nice in that anthology, Unipolar Politics. You had a chapter there where you wrote about... that one I actually read,
So this scholar, the Randall Schweller, the man being interviewed, he published this essay back in 2018 in Foreign Policy, 3 cheers for Donald Trump's foreign policy. And there's a subheading in this essay, No More Uncle Sugar. Key part of Trump's agenda is to rebalance the United States trade accounts with the rest of the world. The goal is to correct systematic and excessive trade imbalances with wealthy East Asia and Europe while protecting industries vital to U.S. national security. Right? The balance of trade is the difference between the value of a country's exports and the value of its imports. When a country imports more than it exports, it's running a trade deficit, which means it must rely on foreign direct investment or borrow money to make up the difference. So in the long run, persistent trade deficits lower the total demand for goods and services in a country, reducing growth and employment. In 2017, the U.S. trade deficit in goods and services grew by 12% to $566 billion, the biggest gap since 2008. Given this imbalance in trade, it is odd that Trump is the one being branded by the United States' supposed friends and allies as a protectionist, hell-bent on destroying the liberal economic order. To these ingrates, the Trump administration has sent a straight message. You will no longer be allowed to play the United States for a sucker. In other words, no more Uncle Sugar. Right? The blob, the American foreign policy establishment, worries that the policies enacted by the Trump administration signal a major reduction in the U.S. willingness to promote global trade and investment, but Trump's threats of tariffs and other protectionist measures are better seen as bargaining chips designed to open other countries' markets. All right, Ronald Reagan did this as well. Right? He had part of his administration pushing for free trade, but another part of his administration bargaining and saying, we're going to use tariffs unless you open your markets to us. Right? They also represent attempts to elevate trade diplomacy to greater strategic prominence, using sanctions and other forms of economic statecraft to pressure states to do the things that Washington wants them to do, but otherwise wouldn't be able to get them to do. The United States remains the world's leading market for exports. That gives this country massive bargaining leverage in trade negotiations, but America has traditionally failed to exploit that leverage, since any attempt to do so draws jeers from the defenders of the liberal international order. Right? Donald Trump has chosen a different path, and good for him. And Donald Trump has advocated this type of policy for 40 years. And Pat Buchanan was the most eloquent advocate for this policy after the end of the Cold War in 1992.
It was some time ago now, but I really liked that chapter. And
that's the one I had in mind, but I did not think anyone. I mean, some people read it and say, "Wow, it's better than I thought," you know. But I put it in a volume at that time, just talking about careers, which your students might think is interesting. It was like 1995, and I was like a year out. But I was doing a lot of edited volumes of people like Bob Cohane, Bob Jervis, Ken Waltz. If you look who's in that volume, for example.
It's an awesome volume, actually.
Yeah, and I was doing one after another. The Elmans were doing that, and so I was putting really good work. I felt like I'm not going to be the weak link, this young guy, at the table. I want to do good work, and so I was doing a lot of good work in these edited volumes, and they weren't throwaways back then. That was good. So I'm shocked and pleased that you knew what I was talking about when I said.
What was the title again? In some sense, be able to write a better story in terms of going back to the story part here. So, but I never abandoned realism. But I
tolerate. It's a big field. We can all exist. They're wrong, but
No, I like, and then, but. Scarcity,
that's right, absolutely. And it's nice to have a big field where we can all discuss it, and I have nothing wrong. I certainly would never
let's continue. So
polarity mean as a structural form? What will its consequences be?
So unipolarity means there's one dominant power in the world.
And then we had meetings at Georgetown where we started talking about unipolarity with Eikenberry, John Eikenberry, Bob Jervis, myself, Jack Snyder, and Steve Wall, people like that, that became the National Intelligence Committee meetings or council meetings that we've done for 25 years now. So anyway, when I said that I think polarity isn't as meaningful anymore, I think my thoughts on it when I would think about polarity was, in a unipolar system, the unipole is unconstrained, and this is a typical Waltzian reading that unchecked power needs to be balanced. Nature abhors unchecked power, so he kept thinking that the unipole would be balanced. But as time went on, it didn't seem like this was happening. But he was wrong. But what's going on? Well, it's because I say the polarity is not as meaningful because it doesn't constrain the superpower or the unipole. So the unipole is pretty much free to do whatever it wants. And so if you're looking at what the behavior of the unipole in a unipolar system, you're better off looking at domestic politics of the unipole and the psychology of the leaders to get a kind of read on predictions and explanations of what's going on.
So this expert, Randall Schweller, international relations, international security studies expert, He also has a significant background in psychology. He wrote in this essay in 2018, 3 cheers for Donald Trump's foreign policy. With China, the United States' only potential peer competitor, Trump has used trade diplomacy to press Beijing to make a number of valuable concessions. U.S. trade deficit with China now stands at $375 billion. During talks in May, news outlets reported that Chinese officials had committed to reducing it by $200 billion by 2020. Right, that didn't happen. Trump administration presses the Chinese government to end unfair subsidies and other aid to Chinese firms. For years, Chinese state enterprises have been buying up their U.S. competitors in high-tech sectors. Credit goes to the Biden administration for putting a stop to this. While U.S. firms are prohibited from making equivalent purchases in China, now the White House is wisely looking to subject China to similar investment hurdles. The U.S. is preparing to limit Chinese investment in sensitive American technology, ranging from microchips to 5G wireless technology. And this is exactly what both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have done over the past 6 years since this essay was written. Another step toward correcting the imbalance in U.S.-Chinese economic relations, the Trump administration imposed anti-dumping duties on large Chinese washing machines, solar energy equipment, levied tariffs on steel and aluminum for reasons of national security. Administration threatened to slap tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese imports across 1,300 categories of products. It's the most aggressive challenge in decades to Beijing's trade practices. China responded by offering to purchase $70 billion in U.S. exports if the Trump administration called off the tariffs. And in May 2018, China reduced its tariffs on foreign automobiles from 25% to 15%. Right. Trump has made clear that even the United States' neighbors and closest allies are not exempt from U.S. tariffs. He's made good on a key campaign promise when he moved forward with a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports from Canada, Mexico, and the EU. The administration rightly cites national security, invoking the Commerce Department's conclusion that imported metal degrades the American industrial base. Canada announced retaliatory steps. Other members of G7 threatened to do the same. But global outrage aside, Trump's justification for the tariffs is simply Realism 101. Right? In an anarchic world, states strive for national self-sufficiency. They want to assure the ability to produce the means to fight, as well as to reduce their own vulnerabilities that result from the disruption of peacetime patterns of international economic flows. And we saw all the destruction that came in 2020 from COVID. So this is Trump's signal foreign policy speech during the campaign. No country has ever prospered that fails to put its own interests first. Both our friends and our enemies put their country above ours, and we, while being fair to them, must start doing the same. We will no longer surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism. The nation state remains the true foundation for happiness and harmony. Right? That is a very realist policy. There's a lot of talk in elite circles and in media circles about the glory and the beauty and the honor of human rights, but the only realistic human rights are those accorded by a nation state to its citizens.
Because structure isn't going to constrain it, so it can do any foolish thing at once. Walt said it would overextend, and yes, that seems to be one thing we could say about a unipolar system that is true, is that the unipolar power, because its power is unchecked, will tend to be reckless, will tend to exercise its power in a more capricious and reckless way. And we saw that with the extension of NATO, and we're feeling the pain of that today. This enlargement of NATO to Russia's border, promotion of democracy all over the world, the Iraq, Afghanistan world, we're going to democratize the Middle East. So we had all these grandiose ambitions about how we're going to turn the entire world into an American centric, American-friendly world where everyone's going to be an American and love America. And we had these foolish ideas, and we got into these endless wars. And so the overextension of unipolar is one thing.
Right. So realists opposed American intervention in Vietnam. They opposed the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. They opposed the Iraq invasion of 2003. Right. They were opposed to the intervention into Libya under the Barack Obama administration, and they've consistently been proven correct.
Okay, we can predict that, but I don't think it's not necessary. I mean, unipolarity it's what we call a permissive condition of very reckless foreign policy. It doesn't say it's going to happen, but it's permissive of this behavior. And we'll also talk about overextension. But what I think the other part that I don't think people realize as much, and I made a point of this when I was talking about why I didn't think polarity in a unipolar world mattered very much, is because not only is hegemon relatively unconstrained, but so is everyone else. Because the hegemon, there is no other enemy like the Soviet Union. If you think about how much power the US could wield in a bipolar world, because others were threatened by the Soviet Union. So there was this other pole. And so the
So just because the United States is the world's sole superpower, it doesn't mean that the United States is going to efficiently and effectively, in its own self-interest, police the rest of the world, right? The United States is steadily backing away from that because to exert its resources in that direction is simply not in America's best interests.
US had that bargaining leverage. You want security, you want free markets, you want all, we'll trade you security for, you know, supporting us on free trade and supporting us on here and all these things. But now those states, and in the third world, they were playing a lot of power games back and forth, playing one superpower off the other. When that ended, it was like everyone for themselves. And the US didn't have the leverage that it used to have in a bipolar world, in the Cold War, to get others to do things they otherwise wouldn't do, to exercise power. So it wasn't just that the US was unconstrained in a unipolar world, but so was everyone else, pretty much. And you can't be much of a leader if you turn around, nobody's following. You know, you need followers if you're going to be a leader. So, so that's why I was saying I didn't think polarity mattered as much. I thought regional polarity, regional politics mattered more. So it was like a chandelier. If we were thinking of balance of power in a unipolar system, it would be more like a chandelier with lots of regional balances of power and regional things going on. But the center of action was not the global power thing. Now, I could be wrong, but that was my reasoning, that I just didn't think that polarity constrained any of the actors anymore. Could see. Yeah. I mean, you know, this is what the National Intelligence Council here, we were talking about in the early 2000s, and you know, things turned around quickly with China. And then, you know, the financial crisis sort of changed everything, I think. The 2007, 2008 financial crisis, that's when everyone started thinking, even...
So the United States is the only major economy in the world that's booming right now, right? Every other major economy is still stumbling and bumbling its way out of the COVID recession.
This government, the US government, started changing its assessments of the future from unipolarity and globalization as far as the eye could see to, oh, now we have China's rising and US is declining, and changed a lot.
Yeah, but wasn't that just a narrative though?
Yeah.
And perhaps not so true if we look at the number one in terms of profit sharing.
I'm like, not yet.
Then you definitely need to read Sean Starr's paper, because it's also a response to Christopher Lane's article a year before about the end of Pax Americana. Where he makes the case that, well, you have to look at the globalization of U.S. capital.
I do think China's coming. Like, I'm in the middle. Like, I say in this piece that I think there's been a rush to assert bipolarity. It hasn't happened yet, and that the U.S. is still the dominant power in almost every category. But I think, you know, now lately, Xi Jinping looks like he's slipping quite a bit. And he is their number one problem right now, China's problem in terms of growth. And they have a lot of debt, and they have a very bad problem with their worker to retiree ratio because of the
demographic problem
policy. So China has a lot of problems. That's what I say. People don't want to look at all the problems. But that said, they have a lot going for them in terms of technology and artificial intelligence and quantum.
So Sean Starrs, S-T-A-R-R-S, right? He's the scholar. And he published this important paper back in 2013 talking about the chimera of global convergence. And his point is that almost all of the world's major corporations, almost all of the world's most profitable corporations in almost every sector of the economy are American. Right? U.S. corporate structure dominates the world economy.
Computing and you know, I would not count them out. I mean, they are a full array competitor now. That's the difference. They're not just a competitor. They're a competitor in every sector. So I agree with you. I'm glad you said that, because I think too many Americans are just, they see a threat. It was like Japan in the 80s. I remember telling people in the late 80s, my gosh, you're so worried about Japan, and look what happened to them. You know, if you go back and look at the cover of Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which became like a coffee table book, who would have guessed? He never would have guessed. And the cover was a Japanese planting the flag on the globe for the 21st century. Well, that's a little premature.
It was. But then, speaking of Sean Starrs, again, I think he would publish his book now in 2022, where he's updating that argument from 2013.
Well,
so
take a close look at it.
Yeah, I will send it to you. It's a very nice article, actually. It also changed my mind about U.S. power, and it's also changed my mind about looking at this in terms of state entities and having a better focus, or focusing more at least on corporate power.
Well, I gotta say, Chinese companies are falling right and left. If you look at the stock exchange in America, these companies have fallen off a cliff.
Yeah.
Every one of them, because they're so worried about what China's doing to its own corporations. They are just killing them.
Yeah, and that perhaps leads us in some sense to the next question, because one of the Trump administration's, at least a desire they had, was to repatriate supply chains, right? So, and you wrote an interesting article. I think, was it in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy?
Yeah, there's a couple coming out, and there's one coming out in a new edited volume by Bob Jervis. Before he died, he edited this volume, and there's one published in a previous version of that. So there's going to be there's a second volume of one that already came out about world disorder.
Yeah, no, but I was thinking more about this article you wrote where you
Foreign Affairs, 3 tiers for
a defense of foreign policy.
Yeah, I wrote several things. I've got a new new updated versions of it that I think are better. That Foreign Affairs in a way, they're very liberal at Foreign Affairs, and they. It's funny. There's a story behind that Trump article. So I published an article that was eventually called 3 Cheers for Trump's Foreign Policy. And believe me, they held their noses. They hired me to do it because they knew I was the only Trump supporter practically in the American Academy. And they had never had one good word on Trump. Not.
I mean, this is just an extraordinary point. He's really the only Trump supporter in the American social sciences, prominent Trump supporter. Right, out of thousands.
A single good thing to say about him.
Right, so Foreign Policy for 3 years has been publishing nothing but a litany of critical, negative, hostile articles about Donald Trump.
And so they said, well, that's not fair. Maybe we got one article that says something good. And so I was the token. And, they were so proud of themselves for publishing that article. I'm like, the man brought us peace and prosperity. What, why are you so shocked that somebody would say something good about him? It shocks me that this is probably good for your students. The liberal slant in this academy has shocked me since Trump. As bad as I knew it was, I was just floored by how little debate and breadth there is in the academy when it comes to politics. Just to give you an example, I'm from Ohio State University. Ohio voted twice for Trump. I'm the only professor at Ohio.
Okay, let's carry on here.
Track again, so please, what did you
let me just continue. It was almost like censorship. I started saying,
it was almost like censorship. Exactly.
That's how I feel. So I was saying that, I'm a professor at Ohio State University. This state went for Trump twice in the presidential elections. I'm the only person that supports Trump at this university, at least in the social sciences at this university. I think that's rather obscene, but anyhow, the 3 cheers for.
Yeah, 3 cheers for Donald Trump. Extraordinary article published in Foreign Policy back in 2018. Another plank of Trump's foreign policy platform is the United States should work with its international partners on a bilateral basis, right? Meaning just 2, United States and this other country, rather than through multilateral arrangements and commitments. And this is where Mearsheimer parts ways, in particular with Donald Trump. So John Mearsheimer voted for Bernie Sanders, or would have voted for Bernie Sanders. But Mearsheimer says it's very important that the United States develop multilateral arrangements to keep China in line. So Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership with about 15 Pacific nations, and the Paris Agreement on climate change. At the UN, it proposed reducing U.S. contributions to the organization by 40%, forced the General Assembly to cut $600 million from the peacekeeping budget, announced its intention to withdraw from UNESCO and the UN Human Rights Council, and abandoned talks on migration. Trump threatened to end the North American Free Trade Agreement and instead struck separate bilateral agreements with Canada and Mexico, which are easier to enforce than multilateral arrangements. So multilateralism, when the United States just one of many countries in a deal, reduces America's ability to control our own affairs. So even defenders of the liberal international order must concede that he is right. This is precisely what a rules-based global order is designed to achieve. It places limits on the returns to and the capricious exercise of outside power in the conduct of international relations. And the reality is the United States has outsized power. Why should it not exercise it in its own interest? So those who champion this liberal globalized order seek nothing less than a revolutionary transformation of world politics. They hope to replace the anarchic international system that we have now, driven by brute force, with one governed by the rule of law. So for these proponents, the trick has always been to convince weak and secondary states, meaning everyone but the United States, that institutional restraints and multilateral commitments will limit the superpower's freedom of action. For such an order to work, it must be autonomous, must be able to enforce its rules independent of the superpower's wishes. Otherwise, there is no reason for other countries to believe that the order will ever limit the hegemon's power. Well, the jig is up. Trump has given the lie to the notion that many of the institutions of the post-war order bind the United States. He has walked away from them. The weakness of the global order should come as no surprise. Ever since the end of World War II, international institutions and norms have depended upon U.S. power, and so cannot be used to hold back the United States. To the extent that the United States has been restrained, it has been the result of self-restraint. United States leaders and foreign policy elites have long championed multilateralism, international institutions, and the rule of international law as values in and of themselves, regardless of how they affect the interests of Americans and of America and U.S. national interests.
Trump, you know.
Why a defense of Trump's foreign policy?
Yeah, well, okay. So I'm a realist, and I would always tell at the time, I would sit down and talk to my realist friends like Barry Posen and all the restrainers, you know, and I would say to them, don't you like Trump? He's America first. He's saying exactly what you're saying, that America should come home, restrain its foreign policy, think about itself first. The Cold War has been over for 40, 50, 40 years now, or 30 years now. It's been over for 30 years and we still have NATO. NATO's obsolete. He's saying everything you say. How could you not support the guy? And they didn't support him. So why do I support him? Well, I said he was a realist because Trump was first and foremost an economic nationalist. I mean, he wasn't a free trader per se. I mean, he wasn't against free trade, but he wanted to be fair trade. And he really cared about sort of neo-mercantil. He had a sort of neo-mercantilist view of the world. Like, so he constantly talked about rebalancing America's trade accounts, no more trade deficits. Because he would say, well, look, we have a $500 billion trade deficit with China every year. They're obviously laughing at us and they're obviously cheating because America can compete with anyone. How can they have a $500 billion? Which makes perfect sense to me. So as a realist, he said, like, no more Uncle Sugar. You know?
Right. The United States, its workforce is about the most efficient in the world, works longer hours than almost any other nation.
We're not giving away everything. We're not opening our markets to everyone and then having them cheat, you know, and close their market stuff. So that was the first reason he was a realist. The second thing was that he always talked about relative gains. He was he had a relative gains orientation. Like, so even with our allies, he would say, oh, those Europeans, you know, we can't have them, you know, eating our lunch, you know, and he would say America first. And then, you know, this relative gains orientation, he would see, like, when he would talk about China, you got to remember, prior to him, Obama didn't talk like this. Bush didn't talk like this. When Trump would talk about China, he'd say, you know, we're not in a Cold War. We're in a hot economic and technological war with China. It's a hot war. We've got to have the best 5G. We've got to beat them in 5G. We've got to beat them in quantum computing. We've got to beat them in artificial intelligence. And they were saying the same thing, China 2025. So he understood this relative gains orientation that, you know, we wanted technological and economic superiority, supremacy over China. That this was.
So this is Randall Schweller, his essay, 3 Cheers for Donald Trump. Says no more free riding, right? The final piece of Trump's foreign policy is his insistence that the United States allies pay their fair share of the costs of their own defense. NATO concedes the United States accounts for 73% of the alliance's defense spending, right? The United States spends more on defense than all other nations in the world put together. Right? NATO has 29 member states. It's focused on European security, and yet the U.S. accounts for 73% of NATO's defense spending. Now, our foreign policy elite routinely deride Donald Trump for mocking U.S. allies as free riders. Free riders aggravate me. Barack Obama complained in 2016. His list of partners not pulling their weight included the United Kingdom. He warned the country would no longer be able to claim a special relationship with the U.S. unless it spent at least 2% of its GDP on defense. For decades, U.S. presidents have complained about our allies' free riding, but when push comes to shove, they fail to do anything about it. During the Cold War, the U.S. and its allies confronted a shared Soviet threat. Now that that dragon has been slain, at a time when the U.S. government is considering huge cuts in social spending to restore fiscal health, there's no justification for the U.S. to subsidize European security. Right? This is welfare for the rich. Trump's attacks on NATO are getting results. Defense spending among the alliance's European members has hit its highest point since 2010. Now, according to our foreign policy establishment, the Blob, Trump is not merely trying to get allies to pay their fair share. He's actively plotting to destroy NATO. So we have New York Times columnist David Leonhardt writing in June 2018, President of the United States were to sketch out a secret detailed plan to break up the Atlantic Alliance. That plan would bear a striking resemblance to Trump's behavior. But the greatest enemy of an alliance is victory, and the West won the Cold War, so NATO lost its raison d'etre, lost its reason for being. So we increasingly live in a multipolar world. Alliances are less fixed. Today's friend may be tomorrow's enemy, or at least a competitor. Trump accepts this. He is operating according to the realpolitik principle former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger summarized. America has no permanent friends, no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, only interests. So Trump's realist instincts are clearly on display in his approach to Russia. Trump has met with the leader of the Kremlin, searching for cooperation on a range of security issues and to avoid war between the two nuclear superpowers. So those yelling the loudest that Russia is our mortal enemy and that Trump is Vladimir Putin's puppet, the very same people who woefully mismanaged U.S. foreign policy over the past quarter century. The bottom line is Trump is not the primary reason that NATO's ties are fraying. It's the international structure. There is no fundamental commonsensical reason to maintain NATO. Right? What annoyed the foreign policy elite about Obama's minimalist strategic goals, his talk of hitting singles and doubles, was structural in nature. And America needed allies, and allies needed America during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That created incentives for cooperation in areas outside of national security. But that should have changed with the end of the shared Soviet threat. Right? The United States became less constrained in its foreign policy. So did its allies. Since the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, our allies have had less need for a superpower patron. So Washington has had less leverage over them. So in 1993, we learned the Soviet Union created NATO, essentially. The threat of the Soviet Union created NATO. The demise of the Soviet threat should free Europe. It should free the West and the East. And it should mean self-reliance, right? European countries should have learned to take care of themselves or suffer the consequences, right? The time has come for Europeans to pay for their own security, right? It's not that Trump created this reality. He merely recognized it.
It was a war, a real war. But, you know, not a shooting war, but a competition that was approached a war. So he had a relative gains orientation, even with our allies. He would say the Europeans, you know, I don't want them to do better than us on deals. He didn't like any deal where we didn't get a better deal. So very Waltz, right? Waltz said, when offered an opportunity to make a deal, states don't say, how much do I gain, but who gains more? That was Trump, you know. Then third, he was a realist because he believed in bilateralism, not multilateralism. He was against globalism, the whole America first, economic nationalism. He said national interests take priority over a collective interest or collective concerns. And he understood that by wrapping American power, binding it, as John Eichberg would say, in institutions, America was weakening its power. If you want to have bargaining power, it's much better to make bilateral agreements, use it in a bilateral sense. So he understood power in a very Hirschman-esque way, in this Albert Hirschman, you know, sort of asymmetric interdependence. He got it. He always say they're much more dependent on us than we are on them. If we have a trade war,
right. So the conventional perspective is that Donald Trump is a moron, right? The higher the intelligence of the people you're talking with, the more convinced they are that Donald Trump's a moron. According to our elite, our foreign policy elite, our economic elite, our political and cultural elite, Donald Trump's a moron. By contrast, this scholar of international relations, Randall Schweller, says Trump gets it.
We win 100 out of 100 times, he would say. Again, very realist. And it rubbed the liberal establishment the wrong way. They would say he's a transactional nationalist. Oh my gosh, the world's going to. And yeah, I mean, he didn't like the American-led order. He thought it had, you know, I'll get into that in 1 second. Just the last one is that he would say no more free riding. So like, you know, he didn't want our allies free riding. He wanted to end NATO. He said it was obsolete. What is it good for? These guys, he would call NATO like, you know, welfare for the rich, just like Barry poses. He said everything that the realists were saying, and you know, but they didn't want to hear it. And I thought it was perfectly consistent with realism. So
almost all of the major foreign policy realists are actually on the left. Right? John Mearsheimer wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders. So Donald Trump has this realistic foreign policy, but international relations theorists who are realists despise him. So is it aesthetics? Is it the aesthetics that Donald Trump's support comes from the midwits and the less intelligent, the less educated? And so international relations experts who are realists, who see that Donald Trump is pursuing a realist foreign policy, they still scorn Donald Trump because they just don't like the aesthetics?
Why do you think that other, I'm not saying that you're necessarily right, but let's say that you're right. So why do you think that other realists rejected it or rejected Trump as a realist?
Because just like Ken Waltz was the most...
Henry Kissinger, a realist, a little bit. He was incredibly self-interested. There was an element of realism to his work.
Strident liberal that I knew. He was a strident liberal. Almost every realist I know is a liberal, Democrat, liberal, and they're just completely inconsistent with their beliefs. There's no constraint in their beliefs. So they didn't like Trump the messenger, and they didn't want to be associated with him. And they were like, oh my gosh, he's co-opted realism, and he's a dope, but he wasn't a dope. They just couldn't get their head around it. They couldn't get their head around this idea that this guy who they thought of as a racist, which he certainly is not, or a nationalist and dopey and very Trump was portrayed as a blowhard, sort of petulant fool who thought he knew things like, I know more about nuclear weapons than anyone. Yeah, he said things like that. He was a narcissist. He was all kinds of things, but that doesn't make him wrong. He was quite right. He had very good instincts, Trump. I think his instincts were impeccable. And what they don't want to admit is peace and prosperity. I can tell you, having lived since Eisenhower to Kennedy to
So when we got the Biden administration, we got the most reckless foreign policy in the United States in the last 80 years, plunging us into conflict, unnecessary conflict with Russia, with China, with Iran, with Hamas, Hezbollah, right? We want American foreign policy conducted in the best interest of Americans, meaning peace and prosperity, not unnecessary intervention in wars.
Johnson to Nixon to Ford to I've seen them all. And I'm telling you, I don't care what you say. You put Trump's record up against any one of those presidents, he blows them away. And yet he's ranked by these historians as the third worst president. Why? Because they don't like peace and prosperity. More prosperity than under any president. For every group, every racial group in America did better under Trump than they did under anyone prior or since. I don't care what liberals want to argue. They can put up any foolish statistic they want. They're wrong. And peace, no war. No.
The same sort of thing happens in the real world. All right. You can be right and scorned by your peers. All right. You can be right and you can get fired. Right. If you are out of touch with the aesthetics and the procedures and the hero system of the people that you want to get along with, right, being right is not going to overcome that problem.
War under Trump. When was the last time that happened? When did that happen?
Quite a few drone strikes, though.
Oh yeah, quite a few drone strikes, but he was actually against it. And he was the only president in my memory that when he was asked, should we retaliate for a strike against us? And he asked, how many civilians would be killed? And they told him how many civilians would be killed in a retaliatory strike. He said, no, it's not worth killing civilians, just to make the point. Because he was a religious man. He truly believed that. He talked about civilian casualties. Nobody else is talking about that. And I know there'll be people who say, oh yes, he had this drone war and da da da. Okay, whatever. I think the man was peace and prosperity. I don't care. They can say he's the worst guy in the world. I would compare it this way. If you had a surgeon and you have a heart problem, or your wife has a heart problem, terrible problem, and there's a surgeon, two surgeons, one of them is a real jerk, but he's the best heart surgeon in the world. The other one is the nicest person in the world, but he's mediocre at best. Which one are you going to hire? The one that you're going to hire the one you like, or you're going to hire the one that gets the job done, even though he's a jerk. You could say, I like Trump, but you could say he's a jerk. Okay. People that actually know him say he's not. And even liberals say that he was a nice guy if you actually knew him. But that's besides the point to me. But that's the only point they want to make, is that he was a jerk. He's a jerk. Well, I don't care. Just give me the guy that's competent, keeps us out of war, and peace and prosperity.
Yeah, but then you should be familiar with Peter Navarro's work as well, right? Because in some sense, he criticized China for being a mercantilist. China is this and that, but in many ways, he was a mercantilist himself.
Yeah.
So and he was
Look
close.
what we got today. Well, I said all these people, the realists who didn't want to support Trump, who was speaking their language. Look what we got today.
Yeah.
War and poverty. There's nothing on the shelves. And, they wanted to blame Trump for COVID. He's the one that came up with the vaccine that they're pushing on everyone and don't believe in democracy anymore.
Yeah, it's true. But yeah, Pillsbury as well. So you're not the only one. Michael Pillsbury was part of the Trump team. Peter Navarro, and then Randall Schweller.
I wasn't part of the team. Free-flowing ideas and debate. That you can't even get people to support and have a debate about President Trump, who was elected president. Whether people like it or not, and would be reelected if they were elected tomorrow. I'm quite sure. But was elected president and gave us peace and prosperity, and we have an economy that is so over 99% against, I would say, is really a terrible statement about academic freedom.
Interesting. Yeah, that in itself deserves another talk. To be honest,
yeah. It really does.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, so maybe Donald Trump would be more effective if he mastered the code of the people in power and flattered them, and said, thank them for their contributions, and then added something. All right. We learned about the craft of effective writing, and the craft of effective writing is that you locate the people who have power in your particular area, and then you tell them how great they are, and then you add something valuable, right? And then they're going to welcome you, right? There are ways that you can criticize that are insulting, and there are ways that you can criticize that are within the code. Donald Trump doesn't follow the code.
You have also heard some of these calls now. I don't know how.
Foreign policy establishment, and particularly the media. The media has just completely been co-opted by the liberal foreign policy establishment, that to the point where anyone that speaks something that they don't want to hear is a lunatic, should be banned. I remember I once said on the radio something like, I was giving a radio national, the PBS, I was saying, I made the outrageous comment that America shouldn't be trying to spread its values per se, but should, try to take care of its own interests, narrowly defined. And the guy on the radio was PBS, was our public broadcaster. He was like, how could you say something so outrageous? Well, what is American foreign policy if we're not spreading our values throughout the world? I go, well, let me tell you, there's a lot of people that study international relations that don't think that's probably a good way to go. But I know that you can't say things like that. So I can just see John right now. He's just completely, he's just been made into a pariah by the media, because how dare I read here again. How
dare you, to quote Greta Thunberg?
Right. I get these, unfortunately, these Yahoo feeds. It's so terrible. It's just a search engine, but I can't help it. So I read this piece that was from NBC News, where it said 8 Republicans. Actually, can you believe 8 Republicans don't agree that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a mortal threat to U.S. security? Can you believe that all of 8 Republicans disagree with the statement that the situation in Ukraine is a mortal threat to U.S. security? It's not even a threat to U.S. security, but a mortal threat. And so John is saying, oh my gosh, he's saying we're actually responsible for this, and he can understand where Putin's coming from. Oh, well.
Right, and that's John Mearsheimer.
This is the problem with academic debate. You can't have it anymore.
Yeah. All right. Let's continue. We have a few more questions, or 2 more questions before we end.
Bandwagoning for Profit back in '94. I think that's one of probably my most cited pieces.
Yeah.
And I do think we're seeing Russia and China bandwagon rather than balance each other, because they're both revisionist powers, and they both see gain in overthrowing the American-led order, and they both feel humiliated by it. It's funny, they're both talking about humiliation and they want prestige, a very realist thing. Like in a Gilpinian way, they're talking about relative prestige. Why do we not have as much prestige as we should when we've grown in power? It's very much like Gilpin's War and Change, and the disjuncture between actual power and prestige being a problem that creates crises that foreshadow another hegemonic war. Okay, just to throw that out there. I also think when we look at realism across the world, realists said many years, don't humiliate, don't enlarge NATO to Russia's border. You will regret that someday, and it has come to fruition. This is Waltz. I used to, in the 90s, whenever I would see Ken Waltz, we would be talking, even when we went to Denmark together, And I remember him railing in this volume about NATO enlargement, how it would come back to bite us, that a realist would never do such a thing because you can't be greedy and you can't do it. So that's very apropos.
But what would you say then about you have claims that would perhaps say, but realist, you're looking at the world from a very high level of abstraction, right? And these countries that joined NATO, they wanted it. It was their autonomous sovereign decision. They wanted to join NATO, like Poland wanted to join NATO and so on and so on and so on, because they saw that as good for their security. So why deny them the possibility to join NATO? Why deny the possibilities of getting more members if that is in their autonomous sovereign will? Right?
Because it ignores power. When you do things like that, what you're saying is, well, they're autonomous states, so let's ignore the power realities and just say they can do whatever they want. But the power reality is such that it is Russia's backyard and Russia will revitalize. And so this all happened because of the 2008 meeting where Bush, in a sort of slapdash way, said, oh, guess what? Ukraine and Georgia are going to be part of NATO. Well, it wasn't even agreed upon, but he was like, well, yeah, we're going to do that. So that was kind of the end of that. Then we got the Georgian war. Now we have the Ukrainian war. It ignores power realities. And a realist would say bad things happen when you ignore power realities. And this is a bad thing that's happening. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, 1 second. I just have to send a quick message to my wife. Because she has been calling me for.
Okay, so the interviewer is John H.S. Aberg, and he is a scholar of global politics in Sweden at Malmö University. He's interviewing Randall Schweller.
How that
So now you're more competitive. You're like, well, I don't want to give away everything for free, and I don't want to be all over the world offering everyone security, and I don't want to do all this. I want to come home and rebuild myself and compete on a global basis and stop giving everything for free, like no more Uncle Sugar, no more free riding.
Yeah, but I just want to critique that argument. And see what you have to say about it.
And just to make the other argument, then on the other side, China is rising, so they're saying we need to be more extroverted. They're doing the Belt and Road, so we're retrenching. They're starting to feel more extroverted. So there's kind of a compatibility there.
Yeah, so you have the polarity argument. So decline, risk averse.
Right.
How does risk accept?
Yeah, I'll have to think about it. No, that's a good point. I like the point.
Yeah, that's a mark of an honest intellectual when he doesn't have an answer for something and he says, I'll need to think about it.
Yeah, all right.
It's understandable. So be very wary if your articles or your theories are more complex than the real world, or that's not our job. Be wary of jargon and things like that. And so have a story. Like the one thing I think as social scientists, we want to be relevant, and we're only going to be relevant if we tell good stories. We have to tell stories that make the world more understandable, and we can do that. We can certainly do that. At least it's wisdom that I've, after 30-something years of being in the field, it's something that I've learned. I think I always had a sense of it, but it's more important even today to me. Two things: to tell good stories, to tell people things in a clear way. We're writers. I read fiction every day. I read 50 pages of 19th century, 20th century fiction. Today it's Theodore Dreiser. Tomorrow it will be F. Scott Fitzgerald. We're writers. We have to remember we're writers. I take great pride in my prose. I work very hard to get my writing as readable as I can make it, as memorable as it can be. And speaking of realism, Ken Waltz's prose is beautiful. He wrote in such an elegant, memorable style. Every page has gems. We have to remember that. And we have to also be policy relevant.
So, yeah, international relations scholar disproportionately do write well compared to scholars in other fields.
Something I learned later, not early in your career. Early in your career, you do whatever you have to do to make a theoretical contribution. That's the business we're in. But as you get older, it is, I think, more important when you become secure in the field and you become somebody that people know, that you talk about relevant things.
Okay, here he is in a different interview.
Where power realities are the central driving force of thinking about international politics. I mean, like today we would think of Kissinger, by the way, like Henry Kissinger was really the last big time realist, that one of the only realists that's ever had been the driving force of America.
So this interview was recorded June 30th of 2023.
Foreign policy. So this is kind of, it probably sounds very foreign, very European to your listeners if they're listening. Let me explain. Like, so when I say dark, the dark part of it is that for realists, there's this concept, the structure of international politics is the key. And this may be a little abstract, but it's not, it's really tinker toys if you think about it. Anarchy. Anarchy means there is no sovereign arbiter to make and enforce agreements among states, which sounds like a big deal, but let me just say, all it means is there's no world government. There's no 911 you can call if you're some state and you're in trouble. You know, there's nobody to call. So what it means is that the international system is a self-help system. If you survive and thrive, it has to be because of your own arrangements that you make. It's a self-help. It's the means that you provide for your own security, whether that's making alliances or building arms. You know, you have to do it. It's not guaranteed. So in that sense, because it's a self-help system, all states strive to be as powerful and secure as they can be. So they seek power and security. Because you say, well, how much power do you need? Well, I don't know, because I don't know who's going to be against me. And this is the second part, pessimistic. Well, let me see. Okay, well, the pessimistic part is that realists don't believe in progress. You see, and like that's not very American to say that. Americans are can-do people.
Yeah, don't believe in progress. I mean, talk about a worldview that cuts against the dominant perspective. Right? The idea of progress is there in elements of it there in Judaism, right? The idea that we should progress toward a messianic age. It's there in parts of Christianity, and it's become a dominant part of the Western outlook, but particularly the American outlook. I can't think of any country that is consistently more optimistic than the United States.
They believe in, you know, Woodrow Wilson, we're going to have world peace and democracies will reign and the world will all get together and eat, you know, granola bars in a field and, you know, get along and, you know, but realists don't believe in a natural harmony of interest. It's all about the idea is that we can never, that we all seek the same things, but we can't share them. This is very important. And
that we're all locked in an iron cage together, right? That's the realist perspective. And we never get to graduate from that. We never get to transcend that. We never develop legal relations. We never get to develop treaties, international organizations that will transcend the stark reality of life on this planet. We're all locked in an iron cage together and no one is coming to save us.
I think you're like an economist. I get the feeling because I watch on you're saying like, so you understand this concept and your viewers will understand this idea of scarcity. This is very important. Like if the fact that the world is built on social and material scarcity, like we can't all have prestige and status because if everyone has it, nobody has it.
And there's really
we can't all have security. We can't all have power. We can't all be powerful. So this drives this sort of pessimism that, you know, that we have to seek power and we have to seek, in a sense.
And a part of the pessimism that he's not stating here is that realists should understand at least that human nature is not basically good. That if you simply bestow freedom on people and freedom upon nations, that they'll naturally orient towards the good, right? The trad, the religious person, and the person who's right of center, who's got a coherent worldview, understands that people are not basically good. By contrast, the Enlightenment perspective, right, the dominant liberal left ethos that dominates our universities and our institutions is that people are basically good and that people, through the power of their own thinking, can develop a rational moral path through life, that they don't have to be tied down by a tradition and by a community and what's going on next door, that on their own, they can develop an effective morality and meaning system.
Primacy, because that's the whole point of politics. When you think, like sometimes people say, well, what is politics? The most simple thing is from a realist point of view. Politics is about who gets what, when, where, and with what consequences. Because we live in a world of scarcity. If there was no scarcity, everything was plentiful, you could get whatever you wanted, there'd be no politics. So realism is pessimistic, but it's political. It's pessimistic in the sense that we can never create a perfect world of harmony.
Absolutely.
And then
so if a boss does not keep an eye on his workers, right, if he just affords them, you know, ever more freedom to act as they see fit, right, unless he is very careful in who he bestows this freedom upon, right, he's going to get into a lot of trouble, that his workers are going to take advantage of him. The basic ethic that drives workers is to get as much money as possible while doing as little work as possible, while the ethic that tends to drive bosses, understandably, is to get as much work out of their workers as possible while paying them as little as possible.
Finally, I'll just make this point quickly, and then I know it might be, but it's that realists are paranoid, because like I was getting back to that point about how much power and security do you need?
And why are they paranoid? Well, think about interpersonal relations, something I talk about all the time. As soon as you form any kind of bond with someone, you are creating the inevitability that you will feel betrayed by them, right? If you feel a bond with me, you'll inevitably feel betrayed by me when my priorities, when my principles, when my values do not accord with what you expect, right? When that divergence between what you expect from me and the way I behave and the way I speak is sufficiently divergent, you will feel betrayed, right? You form a new friendship, inevitably that person's going to let you down, because human nature is fundamentally unknowable, because we change, other people change, and inevitably with all relationships, we become tempted to use the hyperbolic term of betrayal for what is really the other party simply has different priorities from what we expected.
How much prestige? Well, I don't know, because realists say you can never know what a state's intentions are going to be, what they are or what they'll be in the future. So if you ask how much power do you need? Well, I don't know who's going to be lined up against me 10 years from now, or what people are, what leaders, what states are thinking today. So I'm paranoid. I'm always paranoid. I'm always thinking worse.
So when I took off as a blogger in 1998 and started getting 10,000 viewers a day, started making some money from my blog, I wanted to increasingly, take on the power that I thought was oppressing people and doing people wrong in Hollywood and around the sex industry. And wiser, older people than me would tell me, pick your battles, because you don't have sufficient energy and you don't have the resources to take on everyone. And I very quickly learned I had to operate by making alliances. I couldn't just dig down deep to get to the bottom to stay on top without making due consideration for maintaining alliances.
Case scenario, because you can't measure others' intentions, but you can measure their capabilities. So you assume the worst, and so all of this means that
attachments, can't live with them, can't live without them. Yeah, but the most important attachment is to yourself, all right? Are you aligned with your own best interests? Are you a good friend to yourself? Are you at ease with yourself? Do you have a realistic understanding of yourself, of your own good points and bad points, the type of situations that bring out the best in you, the type of situations that bring out the worst in you, right? The type of show that I have done since February of 2020 has brought out the best in me, not in terms of compelling quality, not in terms of entertainment value, but in terms of, what's in my own best interests and what I've created a situation that incentivizes me to do the highest quality work and putting a priority on the quality, the merit, the value of what I'm doing over that which is meretricious and showy and simply gets the clicks. But in a different situation, if you look at my Jim Goad Saturday Night Massacre, right, I will direct a show that goes into the gutter.
The bottom line is, like, even if all you want is security, and everybody, all they want is security. They don't seek anything other than that. They're not revisionists. They don't want to conquer the world or a large portion of it. We can't all be secure, according to realists. It's like the means to make myself secure in an anarchic self-help world, I have to build arms and form alliances. But when I build arms, I'm making you less secure. So there's like that zero-sum relative gains aspect or orientation to realism. It's like, I want to do.
And you see this in families, right? If you change, all right, your closest friends, your family are going to be discomforted by that, right? People want people to be predictable, but often what's in your own best interest is that you grow and you change, but that is then going to threaten your most important relations, and you don't want to fall off on either side, right? You don't want to fall off on the side of sacrificing your own best choices to not cause discomfort for the people most important to you. On the other hand, you don't want to be reckless with your most important relationship. So it calls for a balanced middle road, weighing up your own new direction, your own values, your own interests, your own changes, your own inclinations to develop, with staying in touch with the people most important to you.
Just one thing and make myself more secure. But I can't do that without making you less secure. So it's kind of like a tragedy. There's both tragedy and evil in realism. I mean, but the point is, you don't need evil in an anarchic world to get war or outcomes that people don't want. It's that for a realist, anarchy and the structure of international relations produce perverse effects, so that they produce like unintended consequences, so that nobody may intend to go to war, and war can still happen. Like,
and translating this into our personal life, right? Just as it's the structure of international relations that creates this anarchic, dangerous set of incentives, so too we have to be aware of what is the structure of what we're stepping into, because popular moral teaching is that we work on our own character. But a much wiser path through life, instead of like working on your own character, is to work on keeping yourself in situations that tend to encourage you to be your best, and to avoid situations that encourage the worst in you, right? If you're simply highly selective about the situations that you deliberately place yourself in, that will have more power to transform the moral quality of your life than trying to work directly on your moral character.
like World War I, for example. People use that as an example. Or like people say, well, nobody wants nuclear war. Well, maybe not, but that's
right. Prior to World War I, England and Germany were each other's #1 trading partners, and yet they went into a brutal war.
That doesn't mean we won't get it, because of the perverse effects of units or states coacting under conditions of anarchy. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer, but it's a necessary answer. So,
yeah, and another key part of understanding reality is to understand that the world runs on the basis of nations, tribes, and groups, and almost everything that we individually think and feel, we get from our group, our hero system, our sense of morality, what we consider meaningful, right? What we consider the right way to live. We're getting that from our group. Almost nothing do we come up with on our own. This is a discussion, should liberalism die? Bo Winegard talking with Noah Carl.
Way to arrange a political unit.
So before we continue, we better try and pin down more or less what liberalism is. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. My friend Dan Klein has written an article tracking the use of liberal in I think Google Ngrams, perhaps some other databases, and his argument is that it originally basically meant what classical liberals mean by liberalism, i.e. it's a kind of right-wing economic and socially liberal ideology emphasizing a small state. And then during the course of the 20th century, it came to mean what it means in contemporary America, namely a sort of economically leftist but socially liberal ideology that emphasizes.
Well, it emphasizes the individual and that is born with certain inalienable rights. So the liberal worldview inevitably leads to states with power that are liberal states, like the United States, trying to then carry those values to the rest of the world.
An interventionist state. How would you define liberalism?
Yeah, I think that you're right. This is important because by liberalism, I mean something more general than current connotations, at least. I mean a rights-based ideology that emphasizes the individual and contractual relations, some kind of representative government. Now,
and I think liberal rights are wonderful. They're amazing, but one should not take them as the starting point, as de facto. Yes, of course, we are just born with certain inalienable rights. We should be grateful for when we have them, because at any time, in the name of an emergency, right, a real emergency or a putative emergency, they can be taken away.
People debate, could you have a liberal society that is also anti-democratic, like some kind of dictatorial liberalism? I think you probably could, but that gets into abstruse debates about. I don't think those are necessary for this. So yeah, rights-based, contract-based, consent of the ruled more or less, individualism, autonomy, freedom, secularism, importantly, because as I see it, and obviously this is not original with me, but many people have made the case that modern liberalism comes out of the strife and turmoil of the religious wars of the 1600s. So essentially what political thinkers, philosophers were attempting to discover or propound is an ideology that would allow societies to hold together when people had different religious views, with Protestants, Catholics, etc. I mean, we shouldn't get carried away about how tolerant these societies really were, because at this time we're not talking about extending toleration to every religious minority, but rather, although I mean it did come to tolerate Jewish people in certain societies as well. But yeah, so secularism, etc. I wouldn't say, I think we can talk about this, but I think associating it with a kind of right-wing hostility towards a big government it's true enough, but it can be anachronistic because it's important to recognize what thinkers, such as Adam Smith and David Hume, what world they were wrestling with. Like Adam Smith was not wrestling with a world that had enormous corporations, and the capitalism was not at the stage it's at now. So it's unclear how one would transplant Adam Smith's ideology into 2024, right?
Regarding what you said about whether you could have a dictatorial liberalism, remember that Milton Friedman, the kind of libertarian economist, distinguished between social liberalism, i.e. where the government interferes with your private life, economic liberalism, whether the government interferes with your business, and then political liberalism, whether you have a right to vote and a say in political affairs. And so in accepting that trichotomy.
No, because in some cases, democracy would actively promote ideologies and governance that are anti-liberal, that
Indeed,
are anti-individualism.
As elements of your essay indicated.
Yeah.
So in terms of the essay itself, you said you started out being more sympathetic to the critic of liberalism, and you ended up somewhat more sympathetic to the defender of liberalism. Yes. Which of your own arguments convinced you most effectively?
Well, I guess what I would say is, ultimately, I value individualism and autonomy. I understand that individualism is flawed and it has its own problems and it can undermine community, and that we have to think seriously about that and figure out a way to reconcile the needs of a community with the needs of an individual. But I just can't, and maybe one could argue it's my own.
And of all the systems I know, Orthodox Judaism has the best combination of respect for individual liberties and concern for group cohesion. So virtually all the prayers in traditional Judaism are for the community, right? For the people, right? The orientation of traditional Judaism is towards the well-being of a particular people, right? Very different from the orientation of Protestant Christianity, where the focus is on the individual salvation to a much, much better world to come.
Irrational attachment, but I am just fond of the individual and of treating the individual as, if not sacrosanct, at least the fundamental unit of a society. And I can't imagine inhabiting a society in which the good of the individual is subjugated to the good of the society.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I even understand what it means for a society to have an interest separate from the interests of the individual.
Right. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you wouldn't say that, right? You'd understand the focus on a people, right? If you lived in a collective, you would understand what it means where the group comes first.
And then people get into debates. Does it make sense to talk about a group as a higher level reality? I think it does. And I wouldn't press this too hard because there's obviously a difference between individual organisms and groups. Nevertheless, I think one can talk about a group's interest, and sometimes a group's interest could contradict the interests of individuals. Especially so you might say, if individuals don't want to have children, that would be bad for the group, right? And it creates this kind of collective action problem, because having kids is generally good for the group, but maybe it's burdensome to individuals. And they think, I don't want to have a kid. It would decrease my subjective well-being, that is, decrease my utility. But maybe that's harmful to the group, especially in the long run. Obviously, groups that don't replace their own population tend to die, and that's not good for a group.
So these two scholars, both Winegard and Noah Carl, they really struggle on if there's even such a thing as a group, and what does it mean to put group interests ahead of individual interests. And they'd benefit from more of a background in traditional Judaism.
I think that's a concrete case in which individual interests can contradict group interests. When we're attributing intentions to groups, it's a tricky business, and perhaps one would say one is guilty.
Well, we get our hero systems from groups, right? What we consider heroic, right and wrong, right, is overwhelmingly not composed by individuals. It's something that they inherit from the particular group that they belong to.
Like some kind of rhetorical legerdemain to speak this way. I don't exactly think so, because I still think groups replicate themselves in the same way that individuals do, or in the same way that ideas do. So I think we could speak about the interests of ideas, and some ideas replicate better than other ideas. And of course, Dawkins called this a meme, which has become itself a meme. I'm not saying I subscribe to an entire meme theory, but I think it's plausible enough. So in this way of speaking or thinking, it's anti-utilitarian, because it's contending that there are actually interests that are not directly reducible to mental states, right?
Yeah,
right. Because the utility, familiar with it, but I think it works. It's the easiest one for this. So in basketball, perhaps you would say, okay, a player would like to score as many points as possible. It increases his stats that might lead to a bigger contract, but maybe he starts taking shots that are more inefficient. And so the team would like him to stop taking shots because the team's interest is in winning, not in getting a big contract next year.
So I recently subscribed to the Substack of Aporia podcast, which is operated by Bo Winegard. Let's get a little bit more here. Interview with Dr. Randall Schweller.
That kind of pessimistic view, which I want to underscore, is not the dominant view in the field. Most are liberals, and many are now what we call social constructivists. Realism is like the simplest theory. It just says states seek power and security because they live in a self-help world under anarchy. And unless there's a world government, which there never will be, and we wouldn't want, even if we could construct one, states, there's this saying that Thucydides said, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And it's a brutal kind of reality, but it is the reality. Like, do I want the US to be the dominant state in the world? Of course I do. I'm an American. If I'm Japanese, I want them to be the dominant state in the world, right? If you're Russian or Chinese, you want China to be, if you're Chinese, you want China to be the dominant. Everyone wants primacy, in other words, because that's what politics is about. If they didn't, well, we wouldn't be talking politics.
Absolutely. So many excellent points there. I actually find realism quite refreshing because where you live, because of course, like we want America to be the hegemon, right? The main leader in the world. But
a natural science way, it's really about disorder in a closed system. So it says that in closed systems, they tend towards entropy, which means
term, which is going to be a big topic we're going to discuss today, which is entropy. And I hope I pronounce it right, but you said it, entropy. And, I think what we could go right into is, because you use that word, and I think it's important that we explain it so everyone can understand exactly how you use entropy as a metaphor in international relations.
Yeah, so entropy is the second law of thermodynamics, and it really, in a technical, like physical, natural science way, it's really about disorder in a closed system. So it says that in closed systems, they tend towards entropy, which means unusable energy. There are two kinds of energy. There's energy that can be used for work and energy that can't. So in a maximum entropy system, nothing happens. It's just like innervated. There's nothing going on. But in a more colloquial, this term is so elastic. It's been borrowed by everyone, even English criticism, and art history even. But it kind of means disorder. And the way I think of it is, and it took me a long time, it's such an easy concept, and yet in some ways, and then in other ways, it's really hard to get your head around it because it means a lot of things that all go together. So I think what entropy means is maximum disorder. It means that things tend.
So I just learned about Randall Schweller yesterday when I was listening in my New York Times audio app on my iPhone. I was listening to this article on "Should We Be Hyping a New Cold War with China" by Michael Hirsch, and it frequently quotes Randall Schweller. And I came home from my hike through Runyon Canyon and said, I need to know more about this man. And I got a bunch of his books. I found a bunch of his essays online. I found these YouTube interviews with him, and off we go.
It's nature's. So when we think of time's arrow, let's think of history, just how history moves. If we think of time's arrow as a metaphor, that means liberals think this way. They think that time is going somewhere. History has a direction, which we call teleological. History is teleological in the sense that, like, we've heard Francis Fukuyama in the late 80s said, the end of history. So we've reached the end of history. And what is that? Well, it's liberal democracy. That's what he said at the time. And, we had won the Cold War. There was nothing left to fight for, no ideological battles left. And it was like, he was saying, well, ideas, it's the concussion of ideas that move history. But it moves.
So I could interview leaders of Hamas. I could interview leaders of China if we had a translator. I could interview leaders of Russia. I could interview any foreign leader or domestic leader, people who are intent on power, because I look at the world through this realist lens, and with just a tiny little bit of effort, I'm able to put myself in their shoes and understand why they are so desperate for power and why they do the things that they do. So realism is an effective way of understanding the world and opening yourself up to conversations with people who have completely different interests and perspectives from you, but if you share the same respect for reality and for realism, right, you can learn from each other.
History forward. So history has direction, it's going someplace. Realists tend to think of history moving in cycles. So it goes from order to disorder, hegemonic sort of rise and fall of the great powers, which was a Paul Kennedy book, actually, that people were buying in the late 80s. It's unbelievable, became like a coffee table book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. That kind of describes a realist cyclical direction, not linear upwards, but nature's arrow. I couldn't figure out, like, so what is entropy? Entropy is nature's arrow, or time's arrow, which means that things constantly tend towards disorder over time. They're not going, it's going in a direction, but not a progressive one. And I'll give you an example. So here's an example. I was once watching a commercial for this. This commercial was for some kind of strange, like Swedish lawn and garden like stuff. And you know, how to keep your lawn and gardens manicured, ordered, you know, looking good, temp. So you see in the commercial, everything's growing, nature, it's growing wildly, vines, grass, everything, it's just completely out of control, you know? And then all of a sudden the garage door opens and a guy with a chainsaw is there, you know? and the guy with the chainsaw, he's like, order, I am the orderer, I will impose order on this chaotic natural system that's gone crazy, you know? And you know, everyone's had the neighbor that doesn't mow the lawn.
Yes, I mean, this guy is so fun to listen to, all right? He's such a good communicator because he's fundamentally at ease with himself and with reality. He's at ease with the reality of himself. He's at ease with the reality of other people. He's at ease with the reality of how the world works. And so it's kind of relaxing to listen to him. It's almost, if you really connect with what he's saying, it's as though he's attaching jumper cables from his central nervous system to yours, and you can start letting go of your false, you know, needless, unnecessary, muscular and mental barriers that you're putting up to protect yourself from reality.
Doesn't do anything with their lawn, you know, and you're like, could you please impose some order? You know, I don't say that, I'm not that grumpy, but people do, right? And so you think of entropy is like nature without the order, you know, it's like, it just gets chaotic, but it's much more than that. So in a mathematical sense, entropy means the mean. And as an economist, you all understand, it's like, let me give you an example, another way of thinking about entropy. So if I had like 30 dice, and I told you that the number, I laid them all out, and I said that the number, when you added it up, was 30. And I asked you, okay, so what do the dice look like? They look like ones, right? They have to be all ones, perfectly ordered. If I told you the dice number was 180 was the sum, we'd say, oh, they're all on 6, right? So that's perfect order. Now, if I roll the dice, and I keep putting them back in order, at some point, it's going to get totally disordered, and it's going to go to the mean, you know, which is the most common. What it means is it's the most obvious, statistically probable outcome is the mean, right? So that's another way of thinking of entropy. It's the most probable outcome if you just let things randomly, you know, random chance, right? So you're going to see in nature what is most likely that you're going to see, the most.
And what will hasten a return to entropy, a return to the mean, is if you don't keep up strong boundaries, either for yourself as an individual, as a member of a community. If your community doesn't keep up strong boundaries, if Orthodox Judaism, for example, made conversion much easier, or if you don't keep up protections against illegal immigration, or you even, if you continue to allow the massive amounts of legal immigration that the United States has suffered the last 60 years, you are going to hasten a state of entropy, a state of the global mean, which is frequently chaos, and life is tending towards being much nastier, much more brutish, and much shorter.
Probable thing, right? And another way to think of entropy is like you might have two, let's say, containers, one of blue, one of yellow, and you have a valve in between, and you open the valve. Over time, the yellow and blue will become green, and then you can't get them back. Once you've lost yellow and blue, you'll never get the green molecule. You'll never get the blue and the yellow molecule.
Right. There are all sorts of great things that can only be achieved with strong borders, strong boundaries, with protection, right? The more precious something is, the more you have to protect it. The bigger the walls, all right? The stronger the walls, the higher the walls, all right? The more precious what you're guarding is, the stronger you need your walls to be. And the United States has not been protecting its walls, so all sorts of precious communal and individual lives are just being hammered under this tidal wave of immigration of people who are not well suited to our own national best interests.
To separate and get green and blue and yellow again. So green is like entropy. It's that mixture you lose. So entropy also means like a homogenization, a sort of loss of choice or variety.
Yeah, unlimited immigration, huge amounts of immigration destroys marginalization, destroys social cohesion and social trust. It destroys the effectiveness and the beauty of what you're trying to protect.
So all these things are entropy. So in international relations, to me, entropy is it's disorder. And by the way, I just want to say I have a triumph because last week in the Wall Street Journal, they did a piece on Henry Kissinger because he's 100. And he says, what Henry Kissinger sees when he looks at the world today is, quote, disorder. See, disorder. So I feel like I said this 13 years ago.
You did.
But you see, it's in international relations, what I see is that there's a lack of constraint. So the actors in international relations are not constrained anymore the way they used to be, so that anything is possible. That's kind of what I'm getting at. But then the question becomes why? And that's, I can give you the long-winded answer.
That was my next question. I had actually have a few questions in line here, but I just want to add, before you get to that, I just want to say it's like throwing a tumbler of water out into the sea, and then you can't get that tumbler of water back. And it's
or like an egg cracking, an egg rolling off a table. You can't put the egg back together again once it's cracked.
Exactly. I love those that excellent examples. And you know, I had quite a few questions regarding this, but I think why don't you just continue with the challenges and what we're witnessing right now with the disorder.
Key, I think, is why. You know, why now? Why? And what I say, it's because a lot is the information age. So going back to just your question about why am I, you know, a realist, neoclassical realism. Neoclassical realism is not important. Although it says that Fareed Zakaria, people will know Fareed Zakaria from CNN. You know, he and I sort of were the original people who did neoclassical realism. That's another thing, though. We can get into that later, but it will just sort of sidetrack this conversation, so I'll let it go. But what was I gonna say? Okay. So the realist aspect of it is that I felt like realism. After graduate school, I was thinking, well, we've had this big thing, the digital revolution, you know, the information age, and like. Realists were not talking about this at all. They had not incorporated it. And so I'm thinking, you know, if Napoleon woke up from his grave and read some of the realist books that were being written, not that they were bad books, but he would recognize the world and think nothing's changed since he died, you know, and a lot has changed. In fact, you know, the digital or information revolution is as big as the industrial revolution and the nuclear revolution. It's huge. So I was in this book, it started because I wanted to talk about why, the impetus, why they wrote this. Because there was an editor at the National Interest, which I don't know if your viewers would know, but the National Interest is like foreign affairs. It's like you could get it at airports. It would be about foreign relations, but written more for journalists. It's not about theory per se. And this kind of popular journal, the editor was a young woman, Justine Rosenthal, who actually graduated from Columbia like a decade or so after I did. And she was.
So this is my birthday. I turned 58 years of age today, and birthdays don't have the same significance in Orthodox Judaism. It's not that they are forbidden or frowned upon, but this kind of individual celebration. My birthday, all right, people celebrate my birthday by paying for a communal kiddush, for example. That's a fairly common thing to do. But in traditional Orthodox Judaism, all right, birthdays are not celebrated to the same extent that you see in secular life, because once again, the focus is on the community, not on the individual. So the high-functioning individual in Orthodox Judaism, if he wants to celebrate his birthday, all right, he'll do it with the community by buying a kiddush, right, putting on a kiddush, a giant communal meal.
She had put together this interesting series that was like, she had invited very good people. That's why I agreed to participate when she invited me, called The First Draft of History, which is a very interesting idea because she said, I want you to think about, you're in the year 2050, what would you be looking back at the time it was 2009 and saying, boy, they didn't get that at all. They didn't see this coming at all, you know? So it was like a think piece or like a thought kind of experiment. And most people played it very safe. I was surprised. And I said, I'm not going to play it safe. I'm going to say, what in 2050 would we look back and think about? And I thought, okay, so the digital revolution, what is this causing to happen in international relations? What do I see? And so I really started to muse about this, or think hard. And that's when I started thinking about entropy. I actually was thinking about, of all people, I don't know if your viewers are, Thomas Pynchon, The Crying of Lot 49. It's a great book. It was written in 1966. It's really a masterpiece. And he thinks in sort of paranoid, huge historical, multi-century kind of like conspiracies using the mail system of all things. Like imagine such everything is not what it appears is the key. So I was thinking like that, and and he likes this concept of entropy. So I was thinking, well, what does the digital revolution, how is that changing things? And it appeared to me that there were two things that were happening for a realist that should concern a realist that we have not even considered. The first was more actors. Like the fact that we have an information age means that there are many more power centers in the world, because what it does is it allows like groups like ISIS or the international flow of capital, you'll see capital and information allows smaller actors to punch above their weight, so that you get lots of actors like Twitter. Think about how Twitter has influenced American politics. If you believe in Twittergate, think of like social media, how much this has changed our politics. It's huge. Like Absolutely. That's the other second part of the book, the sort of
and our borders have changed as well. It's no longer country borders. If it's an ideology, it's people with the information age, people across all countries and borders share same thinking. So it's different kind of construct.
Much easier to form transnational identities.
Yes.
Or things like that. I mean, just think like how easy it is to create your own personal world these days. Like you can believe whatever you want.
Truthiness, right?
You want, you can find on the internet, you can find people to back up your facts, your world. So it's, like if you're looking for somebody, in the old days, if you're looking for someone that believed the world was flat, you'd have to knock on doors. You wouldn't have good luck. But if you put it up on the internet now, you'll find, you have a whole crowd out there.
Just tweet it. Just go and tweet it.
Right. So anyway, the first structural point was there are many, many more actors that had significance that could, I say, they couldn't really exert power in terms of like a positive way. They couldn't construct anything, but they could destroy things. You think about the Arab Spring, like you have cell phones. So you could get, they called it crowd power or square power, like people power. You could get people to tear down a government. Okay, that's great. But you can't get, what after you've torn down the government? Who's going to build it? That's much more difficult. So I was saying like negative power, really, because the power to like destroy things, to block, to disarm, to do that increase. So you have a lot of actors that can do that. So lots of power.
So yeah, today's my 58th birthday, thinking about trying to find a turning point in my celebration of birthdays. Turning 40, that was the turning point. I ceased to be so enthused about my birthday, or just a sense of, okay, I'm getting old. Turning 40, that was the big dividing line.
So it's like hurting. So like when you think of the world and order is usually imposed by a hegemon, one great power. But now a hegemon's like Gulliver tied down by Lilliputians, because you can't do anything. You have all these actors that are thwarting your designs, So in that sense, it's like herding cats, a few cats maybe, but when you have dozens of them, it's impossible. So being an orderer in this world with multiple power centers is very difficult. The second thing, that's sort of the structural view of the international system. But from
okay, let's leave it there for tonight. Take care, guys. I want to watch the end of Tokyo Vice.